The storm moved in faster than any forecast dared to predict. What began as a thin white veil across the ridgeline soon swelled into a churning wall of snow, swallowing sound, direction, and light. Patrols that had been dispatched only hours earlier vanished behind the curtain, and the radio net filled with fragments of voices cut apart by wind. No one knew where they had gone, how far the blizzard had pushed them, or if they were still alive. The mountains had turned into a white labyrinth, and the clock was already running out. Inside the command dugout, the mood hung somewhere between dread and disbelief. The missing unit, 40 men from a reconnaissance platoon, had been expected back before nightfall. But by the time darkness arrived, no tracks remained on the ground, and the storm devoured every attempt to search. The few scouts who volunteered to go after them returned half-frozen, reporting nothing but white horizons and the shriek of wind. Even seasoned officers whispered the same thought. The platoon was simply gone. The mountains had claimed them. But one man refused to accept it. Corporal Aaron Bell, an unremarkable clerk-turned-scout with no formal navigation training, stepped forward with what he called a wild guess, a theory based on snow sound, wind shifts, and the faint memory of a distant echo he'd heard earlier that morning. It was desperate. It was untested. It sounded reckless. But with the storm tightening its hold, it was the only lead they had. His crazy guess would become the only thread connecting 40 lost men to life. The storm had torn across the upper valley like a living thing. Snow didn't fall. It slammed, spun, and carved its way down the slopes, piling into ridges that reshaped the terrain from hour to hour. What had once been a well-marked patrol route now looked like an alien surface, stripped of recognizable features. The trees were reduced to bent silhouettes under sheets of ice. Every breath burned. Every step sank knee-deep. Even in daylight, navigation was a gamble. Corporal Bell had been among the last to return before the worst of the blizzard hit. As he trudged through the final stretch back to camp, he noticed something odd. The echo of his own footfalls carried differently than usual, drifting to the right as though bouncing off a hidden wall somewhere in the frozen pass. At the time, he had simply chalked it up to shifting snow. But once news of the missing platoon spread, the detail clawed back into his mind. Something in that valley wasn't behaving normally. He replayed the moment in silence. Snowstorm's muffled sound, not redirected it. The echo meant there had been a surface, stone or ice, exposed somewhere beyond the usual patrol line. And if the missing men had wandered near that same formation, the wind could have carried them along its face like sheep guided by an invisible fence. It wasn't much to go on, but in a landscape stripped of landmarks, even one unusual echo was a compass. Command dismissed his observation at first. The idea that an echo could lead them to 40 missing men sounded absurd. Officers demanded clear data, bearings, landmarks, visibility reports. Bell had none to offer. All he had was the memory of sound bouncing wrong in a place where sound usually disappeared into the snow. He tried to explain the way wind tunneled through certain canyons, creating sound corridors, but his words were met with tired expressions and the quiet hum of diesel stoves. But when the final scout teams returned empty-handed, frost-bitten and shaken, the room's atmosphere shifted. Logic had failed. Instruments meant nothing in whiteout conditions, and time had become the enemy. Bell repeated his theory, slowly, clearly, insisting that the missing platoon must have drifted along the stone face hidden by the storm. He couldn't prove it, but he believed it. And belief was more than anyone else had. Reluctantly, the battalion commander authorized one last attempt, one search team, one route, one chance. Bell would lead it. If he was wrong, the men following him could die in the same storm that had swallowed the others. If he was right, 40 soldiers might still be clinging to life, somewhere beyond that invisible stone wall. With visibility dropping by the minute, they prepared to step into a world of white that erased everything it touched. The team moved in a tight file, each man gripping the rope line stretched between them. Snow whipped across their faces in needle-like bursts, and the wind howled in strange, shifting tones. Bell kept his eyes low, searching for subtle clues. Drifts bent in unnatural shapes, sloping trails where snow had been recently disturbed, and faint troughs carved by boots already half buried. Most men would have missed them. Bell had spent years hiking alpine terrain as a boy. He recognized the tiny signatures of movement beneath fresh snowfall. At times he paused and listened, really listened, the way his father once taught him in far more peaceful mountains. In the storm's roar there were patterns, low thumps of distant shifting ice, the compressed sigh of compacting drifts, and once in a while, a faint echo that trembled like a heartbeat under the wind. Each time he heard it, Bell adjusted direction. The team followed without a word, trusting his confidence more than the dying visibility. Then came a moment when the echo peaked, louder, sharper, more definite. Bell froze. He raised a gloved hand to halt the line. The wind split around them in two distinct currents. They were close, far too close, to the hidden stone wall he had predicted. Somewhere along this edge, if his theory held true, the missing platoon would have followed the same acoustic guide deeper into the valley. Bell tightened his grip on the rope and led the men forward into the unknown. The descent into the lower basin was treacherous. Snow obscured sudden drop-offs, and the wind twisted upward from hidden ravines. Every misstep threatened to break momentum, to send someone sliding into darkness. Bell ordered slow, deliberate movement. The rope between each man became their lifeline, and the crunch of synchronized footsteps echoed like a single organism moving through the storm's throat. Halfway down, Bell noticed another anomaly. The snow here was unusually compacted. Fresh powder didn't cling to the surface. Instead, it had been flattened by weight, significant weight, within the last several hours. He knelt and brushed aside the top layer, revealing the faintest imprint of a heel. It was nearly gone, swallowed by new snowfall, but it was there. Proof. He called the team closer, pointing to the buried track. They didn't cheer, but their posture changed. Shoulders squared, breath steadied, hope flickered. As they pushed forward, Bell's confidence strengthened. The tracks, though faint, grew more frequent, forming a subtle pattern that curved consistently along the stone face. It was exactly where the wind would have funneled disoriented men. A natural trap. The missing platoon hadn't vanished, they'd been guided. Not by intention, but by the mountain itself. And Bell was now following the same path, armed with nothing more than instinct, memory, and a stubborn refusal to give up. Night fell without warning. The already pale horizon dimmed into a gray void. Lanterns were useless. The light reflected off the swirling snow and blinded more than it illuminated. The team relied on touch, boots feeling for shifts in terrain, gloves brushing the rope, breaths forming rhythmic clouds that kept the group in sync. Bell paused frequently, gauging wind direction by turning his head until the gusts struck his cheek at the same angle as earlier that morning. At one point, the men heard something unusual beneath the gale, a faint, hollow tapping. It was rhythmic, but weak, almost too delicate to notice. Bell stopped the line again, raising his fist. He tilted his head, listening carefully. The tapping was real. Not an echo this time, something physical, something close. A signal? A collapse? Or the mountain shifting under its own weight? Whatever it was, it beckoned them deeper. Bell advanced toward the sound, his boots sinking into snow that had clearly been disturbed repeatedly in the same spot. The tapping grew louder, and suddenly it stopped, as if startled. Bell took a few more careful steps and felt the ground dip sharply beneath him. He threw up a hand to warn the others. Something was ahead, something hollow. Perhaps a depression, a cave, or, if hope allowed, a shelter carved by desperate men trying to survive. They found the first sign of the lost platoon just past midnight. A torn glove, half buried in ice, lay near the mouth of a steep bank. The leather was stiff, but the inner lining held warmth, fresh warmth. Someone had dropped it recently. Bell signaled the team to spread outward in a semicircle, maintaining rope contact while probing snowbanks and listening for movement. A few yards to the left, one of the scouts shouted, a short, urgent cry. Bell rushed over. The man had struck a hollow channel beneath the drift, a makeshift trench carved by wind and desperation. Inside it lay the remnants of a bivouac, a charred stick used as a torch, a frozen scrap of ration paper, and a crude wall built from piled packs to block the wind. It was unmistakable. The missing platoon had taken shelter here, but the trench was empty. Bell studied the snow pattern, running his fingers along the trench's edge. The way the snow caved inward told him the men had left recently and in a hurry. They had moved down slope, further into the basin, perhaps seeking better cover. The storm had forced them to keep moving, and now, Bell realized, they were chasing ghosts in the dark with only minutes between survival and freezing. The storm intensified. Wind bent the trees like brittle reeds. Snow rose in sideways sheets, blasting exposed skin raw. The men's footsteps slowed, breaths grew heavy, and shoulders hunched beneath the weight of wet, freezing gear. Bell knew morale was dangerously fragile, but he also knew that stopping was not an option. If the missing platoon was on the move, they were burning energy faster than the cold allowed. Every minute mattered. A sudden gust ripped across the basin and carried with it a single, unmistakable sound. A voice. Faint, slurred, desperate. Bell snapped his head toward the echo and signaled the team to halt. Another gust followed, this time trailing a fragmented shout. The men stared at Bell, waiting for direction. He didn't hesitate. They veered left, moving uphill toward the source, climbing through snowdrifts that swallowed their shins and threatened to pull them under. Closer now, the wind delivered clearer sounds, groans, coughing, and the crackle of something scraping against ice. Bell pushed forward with renewed urgency. He realized that the echoes hadn't just been lucky breaks. They were the mountain broadcasting distress calls through narrow sound corridors. The missing men weren't far, and the storm, in its violent indifference, was the only thing keeping their voices from fading forever. The first survivor was slumped against a boulder, barely conscious, his parka crusted with layers of frost. Bell knelt beside him, checking his pulse, weak but present. The man's lips moved, forming broken words about a collapse, disorientation, and men scattered across the upper ridge. Bell reassured him with short, calm phrases while ordering blankets and warming pads. The rescue had begun. But they needed more than one man. They needed the unit. Bell fanned the team out in a narrow arc, each member probing the snow around the boulder field. Soon they uncovered another shape beneath a drift. A soldier curled inward, shielding his face. Then another, half buried near a cluster of fir trees. Within minutes, 7 men had been located, all alive, all critically cold, but none able to explain where the rest had gone. The search widened. Bell studied the terrain, noting how the wind curled around the boulders in spirals rather than straight gusts. It meant shelter, however brief, could be found further in. He crawled forward, testing the snow, tapping the ice. Then he heard it. A low groan, muffled beneath a heavy drift. He shouted for help and began digging. Snow flew as hands tore at the drift. And as the white wall gave way, a cluster of exhausted, frost-bitten faces stared back at him, alive, scared, and waiting for rescue. They were down to the final 13 missing men. The storm's fury hadn't let up, and the survivors' condition worsened. Bell knew the remaining group had to be close, but they were likely deeper, in terrain more sheltered but harder to detect. The men he had already rescued spoke of a final attempt at finding cover near the cliffside, following what they thought was a safe path until the wind collapsed everything behind them. Bell gathered his team and directed them toward the suspected location. The cliffside loomed like a dark, jagged shadow through the white storm. Snow swirled violently at its base, forming drifts that looked deceptively solid. The searchers used poles to test the ground before stepping, wary of hidden pits. Bell focused on subtle windbreaks, places where the snow fell wrong, where the storm's voice changed texture, suggesting hollows hidden beneath. Then, as he brushed past a mound of snow near the cliff wall, he felt a faint vibration through his glove. Not the mountain shifting, something tapping weakly from underneath. Bell dropped to his knees and pressed his ear against the snow. Muffled cries emerged. He shouted for the team, and they attacked the drift with everything they had. Minutes later, the snow gave way to a narrow crawl space sheltering the last cluster of men. Frozen, exhausted, but alive. They had been waiting for a miracle. Extraction was now the final challenge. The survivors were too weak to walk. Some teetered on the edge of hypothermia-induced delirium. Others had hands and feet stiff with frostbite, their voices barely rising above whispers. The rescue team fashioned makeshift sleds from packs, branches, and rope, securing each man tightly to shield them from the wind. Bell prioritized them in order of critical condition, ensuring the weakest were transported first. The storm fought them at every step. Slopes that had been manageable on the way down now became treacherous on the climb back. The rope line strained under sudden gusts. Snow collapsed beneath sleds, threatening to bury both rescuers and survivors alike. Bell barked measured commands through the storm, keeping movement steady and controlled. He refused to let panic infiltrate the team's rhythm. Hours passed in relentless cold before the ridge finally came into view. The lights of the battalion's camp flickered like candles through the blizzard. Bell felt his legs weaken, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming realization that they had done it. Not one man had been lost to the storm. The mountains had tried to swallow them whole, but the chain of life held firm. Back at camp, medics rushed forward, pulling survivors from sleds and rushing them toward heated tents. Commanding officers offered stunned, almost reverent looks at Bell and his team. It was clear to everyone that the rescue bordered on impossible. Bell, still shivering beneath his frozen gear, gave a short nod before collapsing onto a bench inside the warm glow of a field stove. As the adrenaline faded, Bell replayed the entire ordeal in his mind. The echoes, the wind shifts, the subtle depressions in the snow. The storm had tried to erase every clue, yet somehow those small details had survived. Bell knew that if he had ignored that morning's strange echo, if he had dismissed it as nothing more than a snowdrift playing tricks, 40 men would now be lying somewhere beneath the ice. Officers asked him repeatedly how he had known where to look, what guided him, what map he had followed. Bell simply answered with the truth. He hadn't known. Not for certain. He just refused to believe the mountains could take 40 men without leaving a trace. And so he followed the only trace he had, the one no one else heard. At dawn, the storm finally broke. The sky emerged in cold pastel shades, and the valley Bell had navigated in darkness unfolded beneath clear light. The hidden stone face glimmered with ice. The boulder fields lay partially uncovered, revealing pathways carved by men struggling to survive. The trench, the shelter, the crawl space. They were all there, frozen monuments to desperation and endurance. Bell stood at the ridge's edge, staring down at the terrain that had swallowed an entire platoon and nearly claimed them all. It no longer looked threatening, just quiet, almost peaceful. A vast expanse of white that had hidden dozens of lives in its folds, now illuminated by a gentle morning sun. The storm's brutality was gone, leaving behind only stillness and the memory of what had happened. In the days that followed, Bell's actions were written into battalion history, though he never considered himself a hero. He viewed it as a stubborn act of responsibility, one man choosing not to let a storm decide who lived and who died. But the 40 men he brought back saw it differently. To them, he was the reason they survived a night that should have ended their lives. To them, his crazy guess had been the only true compass in a world swallowed by snow.